Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I had my life figured out. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I met him, a cowboy. Rugged, untamed, and so damn sure of himself. I came to his ranch as an outsider. A city boy with no clue how to survive in his world. But what started as a challenge turned into something I never expected. He took everything from me, my hesitation, my innocence, my fear, and made me question everything I thought I knew. I should have stayed away. But instead, I let him change me forever. The scent of dry earth and leather filled my lungs as I stepped out of the truck. The sun was already sinking low, casting long golden shadows across the open land. Everything about this place felt foreign, the endless horizon, the sound of horses in the distance, the sheer quiet of it all. I swallowed hard, gripping the strap of my duffel bag. The driver who had picked me up from the nearest town barely said a word the entire ride. And now he was already turning the truck around, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the Callahan Ranch. I had no idea what I was doing here. Well, that wasn't entirely true. I knew why I was here. I just didn't know if I was ready for it. A door creaked open in the distance, and when I turned I saw him. He moved slowly, stepping out from the stable, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He wasn't wearing a hat, which surprised me, but the rest of him was exactly what I imagined a cowboy would be, broad-shouldered. Worn jeans that clung in all the right places, and a button-up shirt that fit him a little too well. I exhaled. Liam Callahan. I'd heard his name before. The nephew of the man who owned this ranch. The one who actually ran things around here. I didn't know much else about him. But from the way he looked at me now, like he could already tell I was in over my head, I had a feeling he wasn't going to make this easy. He stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. His green eyes swept over me in a slow, assessing glance. "You the city boy my uncle hired?" His voice was deep, laced with something unreadable. I straightened. "Yeah, that's me." Liam let out a low chuckle. "You sure about that?" Something in my chest tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "Just don't look like you belong out here. That's all." I clenched my jaw, heat rushing to my face. "I can handle it." Liam tilted his head slightly, like he was deciding whether or not to believe me. Then he sighed. "Guess we'll see." Without another word, he turned and started walking toward the barn. I let out a slow breath and followed. I wasn't prepared for the first day. The work was brutal, lifting heavy equipment, shoveling God knows what, sweating under the relentless heat. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. And by the time the sun had fully set, I was ready to collapse. Liam, on the other hand, looked completely unbothered. He worked like it was nothing, moving with the kind of effortless confidence that made it obvious he had been doing this his entire life. I hated that I noticed. Hated the way I couldn't stop watching him. The way his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms dusted with dirt. The way sweat made his shirt cling to the hard lines of his body. I had never been this aware of someone before. And when Liam finally walked up to me, stopping just inches away, I forgot how to breathe. "You look like you're about to pass out," he said, amusement flickering in his voice. I swallowed hard. "I'm fine." He smirked. "You sure?" I hated that smirk. I hated the way it made something twist low in my stomach. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, I told you. I can handle it." Liam didn't move. He just kept looking at me, his gaze slow and deliberate, like he was searching for something. And then, so casually it made my breath hitch, he reached out and brushed a speck of dirt off my face. The touch was light, almost nothing, but it sent a jolt through me anyway. I froze. Liam's smirk deepened. "You're going to break, city boy," he murmured. "And when you do, I'll be right here." The barn smelled like hay and sweat and something deep, something earthy. The lanterns hanging from the wooden beams cast flickering light over the stalls, their glow soft but not quite warm. My entire body ached from the day's work, muscles burning in places I didn't even know could hurt. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It was him, Liam Callahan. He moved through the barn like he owned it. Every step easy, controlled. He had already showered, his damp hair falling messy over his forehead. His usual denim shirt swapped for a plain white t-shirt that clung to his body like a second skin. I shouldn't have been looking, but I couldn't help it. "You'll be up before sunrise," Liam said, leaning against the wooden stall. "Hope you ain't expecting a late start." I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not," he smirked, that same damn expression that made my stomach tighten. "We'll see about that." I hated how easily he got under my skin. Hated that he knew it. I turned away, focusing on brushing down the horse in front of me. The rhythmic motion of my hand against its coat was steadying, something real to focus on instead of the way Liam made my pulse stutter. But Liam didn't leave. I could still feel him behind me, watching, waiting, and then, without warning, he was closer. I heard the creak of his boots against the barn floor, the faint rustle of his shirt shifting as he moved. He was right behind me now, his breath warm against my shoulder. I should have stepped away, but I didn't. "You ever been around horses before?" His voice was lower this time, softer. I shook my head. "No, never." Liam reached around me, his hand brushing against mine as he took the brush. "Then you're doing it all wrong." I swallowed. "I was doing fine." He chuckled. "You're too tense. Loosen up." I forced my shoulders to relax, but it was impossible when he was this close. His hand was still over mine, guiding the brush in slow, steady strokes down the horse's side. The heat of his palm pressed against the back of my hand. Fingers curled lightly around mine. His body wasn't quite touching mine, but I could feel the ghost of it, just enough to make my skin burn. "See?" Liam murmured. "Easy." I exhaled sharply, forcing my pulse to slow down. But it wasn't working, not when his voice was that low. Not when his hand was still resting over mine. This meant nothing to him. Just another lesson. Just another moment to tease the city boy who had no business being here. But to me, it was everything. The moment stretched heavy and unspoken. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye. Liam's gaze flickered downward, barely perceptible, his lips parting slightly, and then, just as quickly as he closed the distance, he pulled away. The warmth of his hand was gone. The space between us suddenly too much. I felt the loss of it like a physical thing. "Get some sleep, Ethan," Liam said, his voice unreadable. "Long day tomorrow." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless. I clenched my jaw, my pulse still hammering. I hated him for doing this to me, and I hated myself even more for wanting him to do it again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel him, Liam, his voice, his hand over mine, the heat of his body behind me. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. It shouldn't have gotten to me like this. But it did. By the time my alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., my brain was already fried. My body ached from the work yesterday, and my mind was even worse. But I forced myself out of bed, threw on my jeans and boots, and stepped out into the chilly morning air. Liam was already outside, leaning against the fence, coffee in one hand, hat tilted slightly forward. The sky behind him was just starting to lighten, streaks of orange breaking through the deep indigo night. I swallowed hard and walked up, determined to act normal. "Morning," I said, my voice rough from sleep. Liam took a slow sip of his coffee, then smirked. "Didn't think you'd actually wake up on time." I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises." Liam chuckled. "We'll see about that." He pushed off the fence and nodded toward the stable. "We've got work to do." I followed him inside, the familiar scent of hay and horses filling my lungs. The next few hours were a blur of activity, feeding the horses, cleaning the stalls, hauling heavy bales of hay that made my shoulders scream in protest. But I didn't complain. I couldn't. Not when Liam worked twice as hard without breaking a sweat, and not when every stolen glance, every casual brush of his arm against mine sent a shockwave through me. It wasn't intentional, at least. I didn't think it was, but I felt it every damn time. At one point, I was lifting a saddle when Liam suddenly stepped behind me, his chest brushing against my back. His hands covered mine, guiding the leather strap into place. I froze. His breath was warm against my ear. "You got to tighten it like this." I swallowed hard, nodding, but I wasn't really listening. My skin burned where he touched me, my mind spiraling into dangerous territory. This wasn't normal. This couldn't be normal. But Liam didn't move. He lingered, just a second too long, before finally stepping away. I sucked in a shaky breath, my heart pounding. He wasn't playing fair. By midday, my body was screaming for rest. But Liam wasn't slowing down. We were repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged in last night's storm. I was struggling with the wooden beams, my hands aching, sweat dripping down my back as I struggled to keep up. Liam, meanwhile, was flawless. He moved with effortless precision, his muscles flexing beneath his rolled-up sleeves, his tan skin glowing under the sun. I hated how much I noticed, how much I wanted. I forced myself to focus, gripping the hammer tighter, determined to prove I could keep up. But then, without warning, Liam grabbed the back of my shirt and yanked me backward. I barely had time to react before a wooden beam collapsed right where I'd been standing. "Jesus, Ethan," Liam muttered, still gripping my shirt. "You trying to get yourself killed?" My heart slammed against my ribs. I was still too stunned to answer. Liam exhaled sharply, running a hand through his messy hair. "Got to watch what you're doing. You can't just—" His voice cut off because he finally seemed to realize how close we were. His hand was still gripping my shirt. Our bodies were inches apart, heat radiating between us. My pulse roared in my ears. Liam's green eyes flickered to my lips. Just for a second, and then, so subtly I almost missed it. He leaned in. It wasn't a kiss, not exactly, but it was dangerously close. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't thinking. I was just waiting for him to close the distance, for something to finally happen. But just before he did, just before the moment could shatter into something real, Liam pulled back. His grip on my shirt loosened. His expression hardened. "Be more careful next time," he muttered. Then he turned and walked away. I stood there shaking, because I knew Liam wanted this just as much as I did. He was just too damn stubborn to admit it. I couldn't shake it. The way Liam had looked at me, the way his breath had hitched, the way his grip on my shirt had lingered just a second too long. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the heat of the moment, that I was reading too much into something that wasn't there. But I knew better, and I knew that Liam did too. For the rest of the day, he barely looked at me. He barked out orders, his voice sharp, his posture stiff, like he was trying to create distance, like he was trying to undo whatever had happened between us. It worked, mostly, except for the fact that every time I looked at him, I could still feel it, that almost moment, that almost kiss, and I could tell, by the way his jaw clenched, by the way he avoided my eyes, that he could feel it too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind looping through the day's events. At some point, I gave up. I threw on a hoodie, shoved my hands in my pockets, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The ranch was silent. The only sounds were the faint rustling of trees and the distant call of an owl. I wandered toward the stables without really thinking, my boots crunching softly against the dirt. The barn doors were open just slightly, a faint light flickering from inside. And that's when I saw him. Liam, sitting on a hay bale, shirt unbuttoned at the top, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his fingers. His hat was off, tossed carelessly beside him. His hair was a mess, like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. He looked wrecked, like he had something clawing at him from the inside out. I hesitated at the doorway. Couldn't sleep either? Liam's head snapped up. For a second, he just stared at me, his green eyes unreadable in the dim lantern light. Then he sighed, tipping the bottle back for another sip. "Guess not." I stepped inside slowly, my heart pounding. "Didn't take you for the drinking type." Liam smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There's a lot you don't know about me. City boy." I swallowed hard. "Like what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the empty space beside him. For a second, I hesitated. I shouldn't have gone. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I crossed the room and sat next to him, my pulse roaring in my ears. Liam was quiet for a long moment. Then finally, so softly I almost missed it, he said, "I don't know what the hell I'm doing with you." My breath caught, because that wasn't nothing. That wasn't casual. That was Liam admitting it. Admitting that whatever this was, whatever was happening between us, was getting to him just as much as it was getting to me. I swallowed hard, then stopped fighting it. Liam exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And there was something there. Something raw. Something undeniable. And then, before I could think, before I could second guess it, I reached for him, my hand curled around the bottle, pulling it from his grip. I set it aside. And then, slowly, carefully, I leaned in. I could feel the heat of him, the warmth of his breath. Liam didn't move, didn't pull away, but he didn't close the distance either. I searched his face, my pulse hammering. Tell me to stop, I whispered. He didn't. I waited. Nothing. Then finally, his hand lifted. Fingers brushed against my jaw, light as a whisper. And then, just before our lips could touch, Liam pulled away, abruptly, sharply, like he'd been burned. I barely had time to process it before he stood up, running a hand through his hair. This was a mistake, he muttered. My stomach dropped. Liam turned away, reaching for his hat, shoving it back onto his head. Go to bed, Ethan. My breath was shaking. Liam, but he was already walking away, already leaving me there. And as I sat alone in the barn, the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin, I realized something. He wanted me. I knew that now. But Liam Callahan was terrified of it. The next morning, Liam acted like nothing had happened. He was back to barking orders, barely looking at me, keeping his distance like I was some kind of problem he had already solved. But he was wrong, because if I knew one thing for sure, it was this. Whatever happened last night wasn't just in my head. And no matter how hard Liam tried to push me away, I wasn't going to let him pretend otherwise. We spent most of the day out in the fields, fixing a section of the fence that had taken a beating in last night's storm. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with humidity, sweat dripping down my back as I struggled to keep up. Liam, of course, barely broke a sweat. His shirt was damp, clinging to his broad shoulders, and every time he lifted his arms to hammer a nail into place, I caught a glimpse of tanned skin beneath his sleeves. I told myself I wasn't staring, but I was. And worse, he knew it. At one point, I was struggling with a particularly stubborn plank of wood when Liam suddenly appeared beside me. Here, he muttered, taking the hammer from my hands. You're doing it wrong. Before I could protest, he reached around me, his chest pressing against my back as he adjusted my grip. I froze. His breath was warm against my ear, his hands firm over mine. Like this, he murmured, his voice lower than usual. I swallowed hard. I should have pulled away, should have said something, but I didn't. I just stood there, letting him guide my hands, my pulse hammering so hard I could barely think. And when he finally stepped back, I turned to face him, heart pounding. Why do you do that? I asked. Liam frowned. Do what? I exhaled sharply. Act like nothing happened, like none of this is real. His jaw tightened. Because it's not. I let out a bitter laugh. Liam's gaze darkened. Drop it, Ethan. No. I shot back. Not this time. He took a step closer. So did I. We were too close now. The tension between us stretching too tight. Tell me you don't feel it. I challenge. Liam's breath hitched. He didn't say anything, didn't move. And then, so fast I barely had time to react, he grabbed my wrist and pulled me into the barn. The moment we were inside, Liam slammed the door shut behind us. I barely had time to process it before he spun around, his eyes wild. You want to know why I act like this ain't real? He demanded. I swallowed hard. Yeah, his hands curled into fists. Because if I let myself want you, really want you. He exhaled sharply. I won't be able to stop. My breath caught. Then don't, I whispered. Liam's eyes locked onto mine. And then finally, he snapped. 1 second we were standing apart. The next Liam had grabbed me by the collar and crashed his lips against mine. The kiss was fire. Rough, desperate, like he had been holding back for too long. And now that the floodgates had opened, there was no turning back. I melted into him, my hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more. Liam groaned against my mouth, one hand gripping my waist, the other tangling in my hair. He kissed me like he was starving for it, like he had wanted this for as long as I had. And when we finally broke apart, breathless, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: surrender. Liam Callahan had stopped fighting it, and there was no going back now. Liam didn't let go, even after the kiss broke, after our breathing slowed, after the barn fell into heavy silence. He didn't let go. His hand was still wrapped around my waist, his fingers curled into the fabric of my shirt, like he was afraid I'd slip away if he let go. His forehead rested against mine, his breath uneven, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shaky exhales. I had never seen him like this, vulnerable, exposed, like he had just broken every rule he had ever set for himself. And now he didn't know what the hell to do next. Neither did I swallowed hard. Liam, his grip on me tightened. Don't, he murmured, his voice rough, almost pleading. I frowned. Don't what? Don't say something that's going to make me think this ain't real. I exhaled. It is real. Liam, finally. Liam pulled back, just enough to look at me. His green eyes searching mine. Like he was waiting for permission to want this. Permission to want me. I gave it to him. I kissed him again. This time it was slower. Different. Not the desperate clash of lips from before. Not a battle against everything we had both been fighting. This was something else. Something softer. Something we didn't have to fight anymore. Liam made a sound in the back of his throat. Half relief. Half something I didn't quite understand. But I felt it deep in my bones. And when we finally broke apart, he let out a slow, unsteady breath. I tried to stay away from you, he admitted. I smirked. Didn't do a very good job. He chuckled, shaking his head. No, guess I didn't. I reached for his hand. So stop trying. His fingers laced through mine. Just like that, something shifted. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something to hide from. This was us. For the first time since I arrived at Callahan Ranch, Liam let his guard down. He didn't just keep his distance anymore. He didn't push me away. Didn't act like I was just some city boy who didn't belong here. He let me in, and I stayed. The days stretched into weeks. The weeks into something more. We worked side by side. Our hands brushing when we saddled the horses. Our shoulders bumping as we fixed fences in the late afternoon sun. At night, we found excuses to stay up late. Sitting on the front porch. The distant sounds of crickets filling the silence. Neither of us ever quite ready to say goodnight. I had never known something could feel this right. Liam still wasn't the type to say much. But I didn't need him to. Because every time he grabbed my wrist to pull me closer. Every time he lingered just a little too long. Every time he kissed me slow. Like he had all the time in the world. I knew. And I wasn't going anywhere. Neither was he. Sometimes the things we try hardest to fight are the things we need the most. Liam thought he had to push me away. But in the end, he only pulled me closer. And I let him. Because sometimes taking a risk isn't about jumping blindly. It's about trusting that when you do, someone will be there to catch you. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications because sometimes love shows up when you least expect it. And when it does, you have to be ready to say yes.